AMISH Chicken Feed Secret: 5 plants that feed chickens for free, grow forever. What if the biggest expense in raising chickens was never actually necessary? Think about it. Every month, thousands of backyard chicken keepers do the exact same thing. They drive to the feed store, load bags of pellets into the truck, and watch the price creep a little higher every season. $50, $70, sometimes more. And it slowly turns a simple flock of backyard hens into another monthly bill. But here's something that doesn't get talked about very often. For more than 200 years, Amish farms have raised chickens without depending on feed stores the way most people do today. Not because they had secret technology, not because they had bigger farms, but because they built their land differently. Instead of asking, "Where do we buy feed?" they asked a much better question. What can we grow that chickens can eat? And that one shift in thinking changed everything. Because when chicken feed becomes something your land produces, the entire system starts working in your favor. In this video, we're going to explore 5 incredibly productive plants that can help feed your flock for free. Plants that grow fast. Plants that come back year after year. And plants that quietly powered self-sufficient farms long before commercial chicken feed even existed. But the real lesson here isn't just about 5 plants. It's about understanding the kind of system that made those farms work for generations. And once you see it, you may never look at chicken feed the same way again. If you keep chickens long enough, you eventually notice something that most beginners don't see right away. At first, raising a small flock feels simple and rewarding. Fresh eggs in the morning, birds scratching around the yard, and the quiet satisfaction of producing some of your own food. But after a few months, a different pattern begins to appear. The feed bag empties faster than you expected. The trips to the feed store become routine, and slowly, what started as a step towards self-sufficiency begins to look more like another monthly expense that never really goes away. For many backyard chicken keepers, feed quickly becomes the single biggest cost of the entire operation. A small flock can easily go through a bag every couple of weeks. Over the course of a year, that can add up to hundreds of dollars just to keep the birds fed. And the strange part is that most people simply accept this as normal. It feels like the unavoidable price of keeping chickens. But when you step back and think about it, that assumption is actually very modern. For most of human history, farmers did not buy bagged chicken feed. Feed mills, formulated pellets, and commercial rations are relatively recent inventions compared to the long history of small farms and homesteads. Long before those things existed, chickens still thrived on farms all over the world. They scratched through gardens, orchards, and barnyards. They ate insects, weeds, grains, fallen fruit, and leafy greens. In other words, they were part of the farm ecosystem rather than something that depended on a supply chain. That's the difference many traditional farming communities understood very well. Instead of thinking of chickens as animals that required constant purchased inputs, they treated them as animals that could harvest food from the land itself. This shift in perspective changes the entire strategy of raising poultry. When your only option is buying feed, every egg your hens lay is tied to the price of grain somewhere else. But when a portion of that feed is growing right outside your door, the equation starts to change. Suddenly, the yard, the garden edges, the fence lines, and even small corners of unused space begin to look like opportunities. Instead of asking how many bags of feed you need this month, you begin asking what plants can help support the flock naturally. This is exactly the mindset that shaped many traditional farms, including Amish farms. Their approach wasn't based on eliminating purchased feed entirely. It was based on reducing dependence by building systems that continuously produced food for animals throughout the year. Certain plants were chosen because they grow quickly, produce large amounts of leafy material, or provide seeds and protein-rich greens that chickens eagerly eat. Some of these plants come back every year without needing to be replanted. Others grow so fast that they can be harvested again and again throughout the season. Over time, these plants become part of the daily rhythm of the farm. Instead of walking to the feed bin every morning, you walk through the property, cutting greens, gathering leaves, or scooping fresh plant growth that the chickens will happily devour. The birds are still cared for, still productive and still laying eggs, but the source of their food has shifted. It comes from the land rather than a store shelf. And once you begin seeing chicken feed as something that can be grown, harvested, and renewed naturally, the idea of relying entirely on purchased feed starts to feel less like a necessity and more like a habit that simply went unquestioned for too long. That realization is where the real journey toward a more self-sufficient flock begins. One of the first plants that often surprises people when they begin exploring natural chicken feed systems is moringa. Around the world, it has earned nicknames like the miracle tree or the tree of life. But on a practical farm, it doesn't need dramatic titles to prove its value. What matters is how productive it is and how easily animals make use of it. The leaves of moringa are packed with nutrition containing unusually high levels of protein, along with vitamins and minerals that support healthy poultry. In many cases, the protein content in the leaves can reach levels similar to what you would find in some commercial feed ingredients. Alongside that protein are nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin C, calcium, and a wide range of trace minerals that help support strong eggshells, healthy immune systems, and steady egg production. Chickens seem to recognize the value of these leaves almost immediately. When fresh moringa leaves are placed in front of them, most birds peck at them eagerly, often choosing the leaves before other scraps or grains. But the real reason moringa fits so well into a self-sufficient system isn't just its nutrition. It's the way the tree grows. Moringa grows fast, sometimes astonishingly fast, especially in warm climates. A young tree planted in spring can shoot upwards several feet in a single growing season, producing branch after branch of leafy growth. And unlike many trees that slow down when pruned, moringa actually responds to cutting by growing even more vigorously. When you trim the branches regularly, the plant sends out multiple new shoots, each one carrying fresh leaves ready to harvest again in a few weeks. This means that instead of harvesting once a year like many trees, moringa can provide repeated harvests throughout the growing season. A small stand of moringa trees can easily produce pounds of leafy material every few weeks, creating a steady supply of green feed that chickens can eat fresh right away. Some homesteaders also dry the leaves when there is more than the flock can consume immediately. Once dried, the leaves can be crumbled or ground into powder and stored for months without losing much of their nutritional value. Later in the year, especially during colder months when fresh greens are harder to find, that stored moringa powder can be sprinkled into the birds' regular feed as a natural protein supplement. What makes moringa particularly attractive for a homestead system is that it does not demand constant attention. Once the tree is established, it tolerates dry conditions well and continues producing with minimal care. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes people make with moringa is leaving it unpruned. When allowed to grow tall and thin, the tree produces fewer accessible leaves. But when it is regularly cut back, it becomes bushy and incredibly productive, almost behaving like a giant perennial vegetable rather than a typical tree. From a design perspective, moringa can also be planted strategically around the edges of a property, near chicken runs, along garden borders, or in sunny corners where other crops might struggle. Each of these locations allows the plant to quietly produce feed while also providing shade and greenery to the landscape. Over time, a few well-placed trees can become a reliable source of nutrition that requires little effort beyond occasional pruning and harvesting. This is exactly the kind of plant that traditional farming systems relied on. A plant that doesn't need to be replanted every year, doesn't require expensive inputs, and keeps producing more food the more you use it. In a system designed around resilience and long-term productivity, moringa is not just another plant in the garden. It becomes a renewable source of protein that quietly works in the background season after season, helping turn the surrounding land into part of the feeding system for the flock. If moringa represents fast-growing productivity above the soil, the next plant earns its reputation because of what happens deep below the surface. Comfrey is one of those plants that experienced gardeners and traditional farmers almost always recognize immediately. It has large, rough leaves, thick stems, and a growth habit that looks almost wild. But beneath the soil, it develops one of the most powerful root systems found in any common garden plant. Comfrey roots grow straight down into the earth, sometimes reaching depths that many other plants never come close to touching. This deep root system allows the plant to access minerals and nutrients buried far below the topsoil, nutrients that shallow-rooted crops simply cannot reach. Those nutrients are then drawn upward and stored inside the leaves. What this means in practical terms is that comfrey becomes a kind of natural nutrient pump, bringing valuable minerals like potassium, phosphorus, calcium, and iron back toward the surface where they can be harvested and reused. For chickens, those leaves are incredibly useful. The leaves contain a significant amount of protein, along with a strong mineral profile that supports bone strength, feather health, and egg production. When fresh comfrey leaves are cut and tossed into a chicken run, most birds will begin pecking at them within minutes. Some keepers prefer to let the leaves wilt slightly in the shade for an hour before feeding them, which softens the texture and makes them easier for chickens to tear apart. But fresh or wilted, the plant remains one of the most efficient ways to produce green feed with very little effort. The real beauty of comfrey, however, lies in its longevity. Unlike annual crops that must be planted every spring, comfrey establishes itself permanently once the roots settle into the soil. A healthy patch can continue producing harvestable leaves for decades. Some gardens have comfrey plants that have been growing from the same root crowns for 20 years or more, quietly returning every season and sending up new waves of leaves. For a homestead focused on long-term productivity, that kind of reliability is extremely valuable. Plant it once, and the plant becomes part of the landscape rather than a crop that requires constant attention. Throughout the growing season, the leaves can be cut back every 4 to 5 weeks, and each cutting triggers a fresh flush of growth. One mature plant can easily provide multiple harvests each year, and several plants together can produce a steady supply of green feed for a small flock of chickens. Another advantage is that comfrey demands very little maintenance once established. Because of its deep roots, it is surprisingly tolerant of dry conditions and often finds its own moisture far below the surface. Pests rarely bother it, diseases are uncommon, and fertilization is usually unnecessary. In fact, the biggest decision when planting comfrey is simply choosing the right location from the start. Once the roots anchor themselves deeply into the soil, moving the plant becomes difficult. That's why many experienced growers place comfrey along fence lines, beside chicken runs, or near pathways that are walked every day. This small design choice makes harvesting incredibly easy. Instead of making a special trip across the property, you simply snip a few leaves as you pass by during daily chores. Over time, the routine becomes effortless. You walk past the plant, cut a handful of leaves, toss them to the chickens, and the system continues working without much thought. This is exactly the kind of quiet efficiency that traditional farming systems were built around. Plants that fit naturally into the daily rhythm of life on the land, producing food without demanding constant labor or complicated care. Comfrey may not look like an extraordinary plant at first glance, but once it is established in the right place, it becomes one of the most dependable and long-lasting sources of green feed a chicken keeper can grow. Up to this point, the plants we've talked about all grow in soil, but the next one challenges that assumption completely. Azolla is not a tree, not a vegetable, and not something you plant in a garden bed. In fact, it grows on water. At first glance, azolla doesn't look like much. It forms a thin floating carpet across the surface of ponds, barrels, or shallow containers, and many people who see it for the first time mistake it for algae. But this tiny floating fern hides something remarkable. Azolla grows incredibly fast, and under the right conditions, it can double its size in just a few days. That kind of growth speed turns a small patch of water into a surprisingly productive source of feed. Nutritionally, azolla is far more valuable than its appearance suggests. The plant contains a high percentage of protein, along with vitamins and minerals, that support healthy poultry. In many cases, the protein levels can range from roughly 25 to 35%, which is comparable to some of the ingredients used in commercial poultry rations. Alongside that protein are nutrients like iron, calcium, and important amino acids that help support muscle development and consistent egg production. Chickens are naturally curious birds, and when azala is scooped out of water and placed in front of them, they tend to peck at it immediately. The texture is soft, easy to swallow, and surprisingly appealing to most flocks. One of the reasons azala has been used for generations in various parts of the world is because it produces large amounts of feed in a very small space. Unlike traditional crops that require rows of soil and sunlight throughout the day, azala can grow in something as simple as a shallow tub filled with a few inches of water. A small plastic container, a livestock trough, or even a half barrel can serve as a growing space. Once a starter culture is added to the water and given moderate sunlight, the plant begins to spread across the surface. Within a short time, the container becomes filled with a dense layer of floating green growth. Harvesting azala is remarkably simple. Every few days, a portion of the floating plants can be scooped out with a small net or container and fed directly to the chickens. The remaining plants continue growing and quickly refill the surface area, allowing the process to repeat again and again. This cycle of growth and harvest can continue for months, producing a steady supply of fresh feed with very little labor involved. Because azala grows in water rather than soil, it does require a small amount of nutrient input to stay productive. The water must contain nitrogen and trace minerals for the plant to continue multiplying rapidly. Some homesteaders add small amounts of organic fertilizer, while others use diluted natural sources of nutrients that enrich the water without overwhelming the system. The key is balance. Too little nutrition slows the growth, while too much can encourage unwanted algae. Once the balance is right, however, the system becomes surprisingly stable and productive. One useful strategy many growers adopt is maintaining more than one azala container. Because the plant grows so quickly, it is easy to split a culture into 2 or 3 separate tubs. This creates a kind of natural backup system. If one container struggles during extreme heat or water imbalance, the others continue producing, and the culture can easily be restored. From a homestead perspective, azala demonstrates an important lesson. Not every productive plant requires large fields or complex equipment. Sometimes, a small patch of water can quietly produce pounds of fresh protein-rich feed each week. When combined with other plants growing around the property, this simple water-based crop becomes another layer in a larger system designed to support a healthy flock with resources produced right at home. Most vegetables in a typical garden follow a predictable cycle. You plant them in the spring, harvest through the summer, and by the time autumn arrives, the plants have finished their life cycle and the beds are cleared again for the next year. This seasonal rhythm works well for many crops, but when the goal is building a more self-sufficient system, constantly restarting the garden every year can become inefficient. That is where perennial vegetables begin to stand out, and tree collards are one of the most interesting examples of this idea in action. Unlike standard collard greens that grow as annual plants, tree collards behave more like a small shrub. Once established, they continue growing year after year without needing to be replanted. A single plant can remain productive for 5, sometimes even 10 years while steadily producing fresh leaves. Over time, the plant develops a tall central stalk and branching stems, reaching heights of 6 to 10 feet in good conditions. From those branches come large, nutrient-rich leaves that chickens readily eat. These leaves contain a range of vitamins and minerals, including vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin K, calcium, and iron. For laying hens, those nutrients support strong eggshells, steady egg production, and overall flock health. What makes tree collards especially useful for chicken keepers is how consistently they produce greens. Instead of waiting for a specific harvest window, you can simply remove the outer leaves from the plant whenever they are large enough. The plant continues pushing new growth from the center, creating a continuous cycle of production. In practical terms, that means a few mature plants can provide several pounds of fresh leafy greens every month throughout the growing season. For a backyard flock, that becomes a reliable supplement to the birds' diet without requiring constant planting or replanting. Another advantage of tree collards is how easily they propagate. Rather than starting from seed, most growers begin with cuttings taken from an existing plant. A healthy stem placed in moist soil or even a container of water will usually develop roots within a few weeks. Once those roots form, the cutting can be planted permanently in the ground where it will continue growing for years. This makes it easy for gardeners to expand their supply over time. One plant can eventually provide cuttings that turn into several new plants, and those can be shared with neighbors or moved to different areas of the property. Placement is another part of what makes tree collards valuable in a homestead system. Because the plants are tall and long-lived, they can be positioned along fence lines, near chicken runs, or at the edges of garden spaces, where they quietly produce feed without interfering with other crops. During cooler seasons, when many annual vegetables have already disappeared from the garden, these plants often continue providing fresh greens. That small detail can make a noticeable difference when feed costs rise during the colder months. With occasional pruning and a layer of mulch around the base to conserve moisture, tree collards remain productive with very little care. Over time, they become less like a crop that needs to be managed and more like a permanent food source woven into the landscape itself. In a system designed around long-term resilience, that kind of dependable plant plays an important role, quietly supplying nutritious greens season after season, while the flock benefits from a steady supply of fresh forage grown right outside the coop. The final plant on this list brings something unique to the system because it doesn't just produce one type of feed. It produces two. Amaranth is one of those plants that has quietly supported traditional farming cultures for thousands of years, yet many modern gardeners overlook it completely. At first glance, it looks like a tall, ornamental plant, often reaching heights of 5 to 7 feet, with broad leaves and striking seed heads that hang or stand upright, depending on the variety. But beneath that dramatic appearance is one of the most versatile crops you can grow for both people and livestock. Early in the growing season, the young leaves of amaranth develop quickly and can be harvested as nutritious greens. These leaves grow rapidly in warm weather and contain a variety of vitamins and minerals that support healthy animals. Chickens will eagerly eat the tender leaves, especially when they are freshly picked and tossed into the run. Because the plant grows so vigorously, it can continue producing new leaves for weeks as long as some of the growth is left intact. But what truly makes amaranth valuable in a chicken feed system happens later in the season. As the plant matures, it begins forming dense clusters of seeds at the top of each stalk. These seed heads contain thousands of tiny grains packed with nutrients. The seeds contain roughly 13 to 14% protein, along with essential amino acids, calcium, magnesium, iron, and B vitamins. Once the seed heads dry, they can be harvested and fed directly to chickens or stored for later use. Many birds will enthusiastically peck at the dried seed heads themselves, pulling the grains free and consuming them much like they would natural grasses or wild grains. This combination of leafy greens early in the season and grain later in the year gives amaranth an unusual advantage. Instead of serving a single purpose, the plant provides multiple layers of nutrition over time. For a homestead system, that kind of versatility is extremely valuable. Another characteristic that makes amaranth particularly useful is its ability to reseed itself naturally. When a few mature seed heads are allowed to remain in the garden, some of those tiny seeds fall to the ground and germinate the following season. The next spring, young plants begin appearing without any deliberate planting. With a little observation and light management, those volunteer plants can be encouraged to grow exactly where they are most useful. This natural reseeding cycle means the crop can maintain itself year after year with minimal effort. Amaranth is also remarkably tolerant of challenging conditions. It grows well in heat, handles dry weather better than many vegetables, and often thrives even in soils that would struggle to support more delicate crops. Because the plants grow quickly and develop thick foliage, they can also compete well against weeds once established. All of these traits make amaranth a reliable addition to a garden designed around resilience rather than constant maintenance. For chicken keepers, the presence of amaranth in the landscape creates a steady supply of both greens and grain across the growing season. Instead of relying entirely on purchased feed, the flock gains access to another renewable food source growing directly on the property. Over time, as the plants reseed and expand, a patch of amaranth can quietly become one more dependable layer in the larger system that supports the chickens throughout the year. Now, at this point, it might be tempting to think the secret is simply knowing about these 5 plants: moringa for protein-rich leaves, comfrey for deep-mined minerals, azolla for rapid growth, tree collards for perennial greens, and amaranth for both leafy forage and grain. But the real insight behind traditional farming systems, especially systems like those used on AMISH farms, is not about individual plants. It's about how those plants are arranged together across the land. Each of these plants produces food in a slightly different way and often at different times of the year. Some provide fresh greens every few weeks. Others grow continuously through warm seasons. Some produce leaves now and seeds later. When these plants are scattered intentionally across a property, they begin to form layers of productivity that overlap one another. Instead of relying on a single crop to carry the entire feeding system, multiple sources of nutrition appear throughout the landscape. A tree near the coop might provide leafy cuttings every couple of weeks. A patch along the fence line might produce mineral-rich greens several times a season. A few containers of water might quietly generate floating feed every few days. Meanwhile, a corner of the garden might be producing seeds that will feed the flock later in the year. None of these plants need to replace commercial feed completely in order to make a difference. Even reducing purchased feed by 20 or 30% can change the economics of keeping chickens dramatically over time. But perhaps the most important effect is not financial. It's psychological. When feed begins growing on your land, the relationship between the chickens and the property changes. The birds are no longer supported only by something purchased elsewhere. Instead, the landscape itself becomes part of the feeding system. The act of feeding the flock becomes integrated into daily life on the homestead. Instead of measuring scoops of pellets every morning, you might walk through the yard, cutting a handful of leaves, collecting a small basket of greens, or harvesting something that grew naturally overnight. This approach mirrors how traditional farms evolved long before industrial agriculture simplified everything into purchased inputs. Chickens were part of a living environment filled with plants, insects, grains, and natural forage. Farmers didn't isolate feed production from the rest of the farm. They designed their land so that plants, animals, and daily routines supported one another. That design philosophy is what made those farms so resilient. And it's the same philosophy that many modern homesteaders are rediscovering today. Because once you begin looking at your land not just as space, but as a system capable of producing feed, you start noticing opportunities everywhere. A sunny corner could hold a perennial plant. A fence line could support a patch of greens. A small container of water could produce protein-rich growth. Little by little, the landscape becomes more productive, and the flock becomes less dependent on what comes in a bag. And the most encouraging part of all is that none of this requires transforming your entire property overnight. Self-sufficient farms are not built in a single season. They grow slowly, the same way the plants themselves do. One plant is added this year. Another patch expands next year. A small experiment turns into a permanent feature of the landscape. Over time, those small decisions begin stacking together until something remarkable happens. What once looked like a simple backyard begins functioning more like a living food system. The chickens still scratch, still roam, still lay eggs every morning, but more and more of what they eat comes directly from the land around them. The feed store becomes less central to the process, and the property itself becomes more productive every season. That is the quiet lesson hidden behind systems like the ones used by traditional farmers. Not a secret formula, and not a single miracle plant, but a way of thinking about land, animals, and food production as parts of one connected system. Start small. Plant one useful crop this season. Watch how it grows. Learn what works in your climate and on your soil. Then add another piece to the system next year. Little by little, the landscape will begin doing more of the work for you. And one day, you may step outside, look across your yard, and realize that feeding your chickens is no longer something you mostly buy. It's something your land produces.